Welcome to today's web chat, Vegetation Assessment in the EIA process. Today we have Antoinette Essel Knox. She holds an MSc in Environmental Science and specializes in vegetation and threatened plant species assessments. She is the sole proprietor of Demela Eco Consulting and has been working in the field of ecological impact assessment since 2007. She's registered as a professional natural scientist with SACNAS. Her work experience ranges from linear infrastructure development applications, conservation, strategic environmental assessments, and open space plans for municipalities, as well as input into an update of the Gauteng Biodiversity Outlook report. She originally qualified with a BSc Agri degree and commenced work at the Pretoria Botanical Garden, growing indigenous plants. From here, she recycled into the environmental education department, working mostly with schools in disadvantaged areas. Although environmental education is still one of her greatest passions, she furthered her studies and pursued an opportunity to work as a terrestrial ecologist at an environmental consultancy. This allowed her to broaden her knowledge and skills in the field of environmental impact assessments and conservation. And after 5 years, she started Demela Eco Consulting. She counts herself lucky to work with numerous specialists in the field and stay abreast of new legislation, policies, and guidelines governing environmental management in South Africa. Thank you again, Antoinette, for making time for this web chat.
Okay, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Okay, yeah, well, so as you've heard, I've worked as a vegetation specialist for 17 years now. I count myself very lucky that I get paid to look at plants. It's very rare to just go to, what you can see there in the background, beautiful grasslands, and spend a whole day there and actually get paid for it. But I have my job security thanks to our constitution. So if we can just get to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I can't manage this. Somebody, there you go. Thank you. So for those who don't know, every single person in this country, whether you live in a shack on the Jukskei River or in Waterkloof or on a farm, every single person has an environmental right. And that's been given to us in our constitution, in the Bill of Rights. Now, firstly, an environment that's not harmful to your health, as well as one that is protected. And under that protection is where my job security lies. It is prevention of pollution and specifically, for me, ecological degradation, to promote conservation, and to see, if we develop, let's do it sustainable. Let's consider the environment in the process. In South Africa, the government is the custodian of the environment. In other words, they have to look after it on our behalf. So if a mine is polluting or if something bad, sewage in the water, the government is ultimately responsible for that. And they have to provide us with an environment that's not harmful to our health. Now, in order to do that, if we can get to the next slide, they have set a number of legislation in place. When it comes to the environment, the overarching legislation is the National Environmental Management Act. Underneath that, there's several other laws. I've just listed the Waste Act, Air Quality, Protected Areas, and then the Biodiversity Act is the one that I focus within, as well as the National Environmental Management Act. So those two govern what I do for a living. And especially because this is a rehabilitation society, if you look in the background of that picture, that green grassland there has all been rehabilitated. I was actually amazed. It was a good rainy season. So I would like to see that rehabilitated grassland maybe after a drought of a year or two. But yeah, I was quite amazed and pleasantly surprised to see that. Okay, so the next slide. So what I do, I know there's probably environmental assessment practitioners here online, but this is a very simplified process diagram of where I fit into the bigger picture. If anybody wants to develop, they must go to NEMA, and in NEMA, the Environmental Management Act, there would be listed activities. And if the activity that you want to do, whether you're a mine, a farmer, or a developer wants to put up high-rise buildings, you have to go and see if that activity that you're proposing is listed. And if it is, you will have to do a basic assessment or environmental impact assessment to eventually get environmental authorization. So that can involve various studies depending on the activity. So mostly the impact studies would be visual. Eskom has to do visual impact assessments, so most of their power lines. You can get traffic assessment, air quality assessment, agricultural assessment, as well as social and heritage. And I just feature under the biodiversity assessment. So, sorry, if you can just click the next slide. In biodiversity, there's again specialization fields. There's wetlands, there's mammals, there's avifauna. You can even get an entomologist that has to do insect study, reptiles and amphibians, and then me, vegetation and plant species. So that's the area I focus in the bigger picture. So once all these impact studies are done, they go to the environmental assessment practitioner, who I take my hat off to them. They have to combine all of the results of all the different specialists, as well as consider with the client alternatives and mitigation measures. Then this is all written up in a draft environmental assessment report that goes out for public review. And that public review is again where the Constitution, where everyone's environmental right comes in. You've got the right to comment on any development that can impact on the environment. And I think very few of us do that. You can see a placard going up and see, oh, people want to develop here, but you don't actually go and read. All these reports has to be made available to the public. So you can go and read online what the reports say. And if you don't agree with them, this is your chance to comment on that. From here, your comment, as well as the draft EIA, has to go to government. It could be local government or national government for environmental authorization. And they can either authorize it, they can reject it. There's been a number of projects that's been rejected. Or they can just ask for amendments. For instance, if they feel that you can conserve more open space, they can ask you to reduce your footprint of your development. So that in total is a very short indication of the whole process and where I fit in. Okay, the next slide. What we used to, like I said, I've been in the business for 17 years. And when I started out, there wasn't a set rule of what has to be in your report. But most specialists governed themselves quite well, and we had methodologies in place, and we would share it with different consultants on how to get the best assessment and the best, how can I say, indication of what is on site to whomever needs to approve this development. But like I said, there was no actual standard. Some of the provinces had guidelines, which we adhered to, but again, it was just a guideline. It wasn't something that was going to stand up in court. So I think it was somewhere in COVID, the protocols was gazetted. So Environmental Affairs came out with specific protocols for each type of impact study, and that was gazetted. So now every report has to follow the protocols. And I'm concerned with, it's quite a mouthful, the protocol for specialist assessment and minimum report content requirements for impact studies in the terrestrial biodiversity or the plant species themes. So there's two protocols that I have to adhere to. There's an avifauna one, there's different, I think there's an aquatic one or wetland one. So every specialist in that biodiversity field reports has to adhere as a minimum to what is in these protocols. Okay, next slide. Then, coupled with that, this also came out more or less the same time. It's the Environmental Affairs Screening Tool. It's a phenomenal database. It takes together all the biodiversity, and not just biodiversity, but environmental impact activities or features that has to be considered before you do a development. So you've got the website there. You can just type in screening tool. It'll take you to the website. You pull in your site, or you can go and search for your site, and then you can ask the database to generate you a report. Now that report will give you all the sensitivities that from a national perspective is important to address in an environmental impact assessment report. And one of them would be the terrestrial biodiversity as well as plant species. Also animal species, I think it even has aviation. If you want to do solar panels, you can't do it if there's already a little airport close to it. So this screening tool report will give you all that information. It's actually quite phenomenal. It takes a while to download because it has to really search through a lot of databases to give you your report. And I will show you some examples of it a bit later. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when I start my work, I basically begin with a desktop assessment, as we call it. So all of this information, we are really lucky in South Africa. Everything is available online. Every province has got a conservation plan. If you can't source it from them, it is online on the SANBI BGIS website. This, for instance, is a site that was proposed for development, and it's in Gauteng. So it's the Gauteng Conservation Plan. Every conservation plan you'll see there in the right has got critical biodiversity areas as well as ecological support areas. Now, those are the areas that the province would like to see conserved for various reasons. A critical biodiversity area, for instance, would have sensitive plant species, could have sensitive fauna species, but for some or other reason, that area needs to be conserved. It should ideally not be developed. Then you get ecological support areas. They're usually along rivers or open spaces, and they try and form a corridor between the critical biodiversity areas to help maintain the ecological function. Okay, next slide. You can see there's one in Limpopo. That was, for instance, a mine. You can see there's no natural habitat remaining, is that gray area. So there already the conservation plan has taken into account that that whole area has been mined. So they don't really care what happens there. There's nothing to conserve. Where they're proposing to expand to, you'll say, is other natural areas. Now, that doesn't mean it's not having a conservation value. It just means that there's a lot of that type of vegetation. That vegetation is not threatened. They're not expecting any sensitive plant or animal species there. But if you look to the west, there's a critical biodiversity area, 1 and 2. In other words, there's something there. There's most likely sensitive plant species or bird species that frequent that area. So from a desktop perspective, I can already see that the chances, if they do some mitigation, not to have edge effects on the critical biodiversity area, that mine could probably expand into that area. Okay, next slide is Mpumalanga. That was Limpopo. This is Mpumalanga's conservation plan, and this was for a proposed pipeline. You can see the pipeline traverses irreplaceable as well as a CBA optimal area. So those areas are what the province sees as probably very good grassland still, as well as probably threatened species. The red follows wetland areas. And the pipeline is going to go straight through this. But here towards the south, you'll see the conservation plan also takes into account the areas that's been heavily modified. That's usually areas that's been mined or moderately modified, which is old land. So even though it's been fallow, it's not been plowed maybe for a number of years, and there's some grassland, it would be secondary. So it wouldn't really contribute to conserving a threatened grassland type, for instance. And what's interesting on this conservation plan as well is from a desktop perspective, I can already tell the client that, hang on, why do you want to fragment the critical biodiversity area? You're going to get maybe, from Mpumalanga might give some pushback. So rather see if you can't take your pipeline along the fence at the western edge of that critical biodiversity area. And you'll see it has been considered later on. Okay, next slide. The next thing I also like to do is look at old aerial imagery. Now you've got Google Earth, that only goes back a couple of years, but we are also, again, lucky in South Africa that we've got an online database, and there's the website for you. If you go in on there and you click on aerial photography, you'll get this screen with loads of little dots. Now the different colors are different years when there was actually still planes flying, taking aerial photographs. So for instance, the blue dots there, if you hover over them, they would tell you, okay, this was that flight path and it was taken in 1947, for instance. Then you can click on that blue one if that's the image you want, and it'll give you a link and you can download an aerial image. So you'll see most of the country has been flown in the past and it's all available. So in the next slide, you'll see it's that same pipeline, but on an aerial imagery of 1981. there you can see the southern part has been completely, it's been scraped, some of it has been cultivated. So I'm not expecting that even after 40 years there be any good grassland remaining there. But that northern part, which the Mpumalanga Conservation Plan also flagged as a critical biodiversity area, is still good grassland. Or it was in 1981. And here you can see they've already considered that western pipeline that doesn't fragment the CBA. It goes to the west of it on an existing fence line. So there's also an existing road, which will limit your impacts again. So the next image, the next slide shows you a Google Earth image. That's more recent. So if you look at the newer image, you think, oh no, it's all good condition grassland. But if you go back, it tells you a different story. And even if you get to site and you don't understand what you're seeing, like, there's some good grass species, but it looks so disturbed, then aerial imagery is really, really valuable in helping you, especially for wetlands as well, to understand what has happened on the site before. Okay, the next slide. We also have these databases are also available online. We've got threatened ecosystems in South Africa that we have to look at. And again, it's the same pipeline. You'll see that that critical biodiversity area in the north is flagged as a vulnerable ecosystem. So that's a grassland type that has become quite threatened because it's mined up and it's been cultivated. So there's very few remaining natural grasslands left. But this database also at the bottom, you'll see everything that we've seen in 1981 has been completely disturbed. This database still shows that as vulnerable. But even after a site visit, I can prove that that's really just a bit of a gemors. There's really nothing natural there. So this helps you to say, okay, this is what we think is there. But if you go to site, we can actually very easily show that the southern portion is not in a threatened ecosystem anymore. That is just not, it doesn't contribute to conserving that grassland type. The next slide shows that we also have hydrology layers. Again, it's online, freely available. Here also you see the wetland person will see that this pipeline, the way they propose it here, will traverse quite a big wetland area, where if they keep to the western one that we eventually propose, it's a much shorter area of wetland that will be impacted on. So, and I think that to me sums up the EIA process, is that you can look at what is the proposed development, but then lessen the impact. So this pipeline eventually went west and cut out that whole CBA area, remained natural. Okay, next slide. This again, if I look at that site, the screening tool that I talked about in the beginning, the screening tool would tell me there's critical biodiversity areas, which we've seen on the Mpumalanga Conservation Plan, and it also flags that vulnerable ecosystem. But I've already, from aerial images, deduced that not the whole site falls in a vulnerable ecosystem anymore. Then the next slide, if you click, will show you that also sensitive plant species are flagged in the screening tool report. On this side, there would be, according to the database, a medium possibility for 2 sensitive plant species to occur. To get the names of those plant species, because they're just numbered here, you have to submit all your credentials and your SACNAS registration to Environmental Affairs, and they would send you the names of these species. Usually, if the name is obscured like this, it's plants that are used in the horticultural trade, so people would just go and dig them up or sell them to overseas collectors. So that's why it's just a way to try and keep the species safe, is by actually not giving their names. I think we're also in the reports, in the plant species assessment report, if you find a threatened species, you're not allowed to actually put the name in the report. You just refer to its sensitive species numbers. Okay, next slide. Then is the part that I actually really enjoy about my work, and that is the site assessments. We sometimes get to see amazing places, but also it's quite difficult. Like on the left top screen there, you'll see we were in the Eastern Cape and everything, it was just raining. But we were there, we had to fly down, we can't postpone. So the only way to get to our site was this little crossing, which was very slippery, but we made it back and forth for 2 days. It's also very beautiful. We get to see places like on the far right-hand side, we had a project along the Orange River. And the day before, the client told me, oh no, somebody will meet me there next to the river with a boat because it's easier to access the site from the weir. So from the riverside. And I assumed, oh, okay, oh, we'll have a little boat with an engine. But when we arrived, we really just had a kayak. And luckily, me and my colleague Rudy there have both rowed before, and we didn't tip each other into the Orange River. But yeah, that's all in a day's work to fly down to Kimberley, take a kayak up the Orange River and then fly back with a wet bum from Kimberley. The next slide also will show you that, I was very lucky. It was a private conservation area that needed to build roads, but you can see it's quite treacherous areas to move through. And even after 3 days, we haven't covered the areas that we were supposed to cover. So lucky for me, the head ranger said, well, he's got a microlight. Do I mind flying with him? And I said, absolutely not. So again, I got paid to do something that other people paid to do. And from this aerial perspective really helped to see how we can maybe change the layout of the roads to have less of an impact. And the next slide will show you that it's not always as fun. This was also close to Kimberley, where the mine insisted on sending their security with us because they had lots of threats from the illegal miners. Then we sometimes have our own personal security. In Gauteng as well, most sites in Gauteng, I don't work without armed security, but they are very well trained. And I must say, in 17 years, I've really had mostly just people who's really interested in what you do on site. But it's also sometimes, the next slide you'll see, these are also things we see. This smelter, you'll see it borders on a wetland area, which amazingly enough still had, some Kniphofia species, even orchids. But this is one of the companies that really do their bit. I was there to monitor, not even to prevent anything happening, just to see that they are staying to the rules and that the wetland species are still intact. So I've seen over the years that, especially the mines, they've gone from really just, trying to ignore the environmental manager to really, coming to the party when it comes to environmental management. Not all of them. I know it's still a big struggle for environmental managers at a mine, but many literally pay you to just come and monitor to see that they haven't had an impact on the surrounding vegetation, that their protected trees are still intact, and they can report on that. Okay, next slide. Once all of that is done, unfortunately, I get stuck behind my computer for hours and I drink too much coffee. And even my own plants die in the process. So that is the part that none of the specialists like, I'm quite sure. Next slide will show you that where we then, we've been to site. So on the next slide, I will show you that's the screening tool result for a site just north of Kriel. And you can see the screening tool results for terrestrial biodiversity shows the whole site as being very high sensitivity. But that's kind of unlikely. And what flagged that is that there's a critical biodiversity area as well as I think it was a threatened grassland type. So on the next slide, that's actually the Mpumalanga conservation plan for the same site. And you'll see that according to the national database, everything is high. But if you start going down to the provincial level, they have a critical biodiversity area only in the northeastern corner, that orange spot there. The rest, they acknowledge, has been heavily modified. That was completely mined up. Most of it very well rehabilitated, I must say. And then there's a lot of old lands in there. And then the other natural areas, the green, is a bit of remaining grassland all along the Olifants River. So on the next slide, you'll see my actual this is, once I've been to site and I've looked at the vegetation, I can see that CBA was actually good condition grassland. So Mpumalanga rightly marked that as a critical biodiversity area. And then all those other natural areas are also good grassland along the river that can be conserved, where the rest I've classified as secondary grassland, old fields or rehabilitated lands. And so on the next slide, you'll see that is eventually my sensitivity map compared to the red one of the national database. Now we can go to site, we can prove what we've seen there, and we whittle it down to this is the sensitivity from a vegetation perspective for that site. And you'll see that most of the site is low because it's got no value to contribute to conservation. However, the grassland is a threatened grassland type, so them I've marked medium to high, along with the rivers, and any kind of moist grassland patches would be high sensitivity. So this gives you how can I say, more accurate view of the site and its sensitivities. The next slide is just an example of power lines. These are like 300-kilometer power lines. Eskom has to have alternatives. They can't just say, well, we want this power line and klaar. So we assess this. It takes, you can't really do a fine scale job. So we do spot checks along these routes at this level. And then from these three alternatives, we have to now decide, you know, as specialists, which one would be the best way forward. On the next slide, you'll see my sensitivity map, which made it very difficult for me to decide which power line alternative would be the best here or would have the least impact, because all of them is going to have a big impact. This line goes to the Northern Cape and the Western Cape, and especially the western section, there's lots of quartz patches there, which is very sensitive, with plant species preferring to only grow in that quartz patch and nowhere else on, you know, on Earth. So one pylon can effectively, in that quartz patch, can wipe out a whole population. So, but luckily it's not just me, you know, the geologist might say, oh no, this corridor 3 has got dolomite, so you can't put pylons there. The wetland person might say, no, corridor 3 has got too many wetlands. And so we will eventually, you know, try and get it to at least one preferred corridor. And if there's still, for instance, a quartz patch in the way, Eskom can then do a deviation and apply for a deviation, you know, to maybe just cut a corner or cut out that section of the site. The next slide is also just a power line. It just gives you an example of you know, you start big and then you try and get a picture of the site. Here was Egoli granite grassland in Gauteng, which is a highly threatened grassland system. It only occurs in Gauteng, and we all know that it's built up to capacity in Gauteng. So all the good grasslands and the wetland areas were marked here as high or medium. And then you'll also see I found some protected, they weren't threatened, but just provincially protected plant species along the route. So this helps you, once you have the picture, to decide, okay, which route will have the least impact. So obviously you will choose, I can't point now, but you will try and avoid the most red areas as well as plant species populations. So next slide. Okay, that's just a smaller development where somebody wanted to expand their current operations. To the north, they have moist grassland. I can't say it's a wetland. I'm not a wetland specialist, but it is a wetland. So they can't go that way. To the east, they've got alien invasive plants with some good grassland, and then a secondary grassland here to the west, which was all historically cultivated. So it's just secondary now. But you'll also see that I found crinum species north of that site. As part of the protocols, they want you to look at a project area of influence, not just the site. So anything around the site that can be impacted on. And usually in Gauteng, we used to look at 200 meters around the site. So that's how I picked up those crinums. So I wouldn't go, for instance, to the south into the cultivated land, because I know it's highly unlikely to find anything sensitive there. But I would spend some time, if you've got landowner permission, to go around the site. The next slide is just a summary then of the sensitivities of this site. The moist area he needs to stay away from. Then he's got a lot of low sensitivity areas that he can expand into, but ideally this area of medium, which was still good grassland and it's got some protected, provincially protected plant species, that area ideally he should then not develop. So, you know, if he goes with this, then for his environmental authorization and he does his layout in the areas of low sensitivity, the chances are better for him to get his approval. Okay, next slide. So another thing that we look for is it doesn't fall under NEMA, but it falls under the National Forestry Act as protected trees. They've become there's a lot of work in that suddenly, especially with solar panels, because they take out hectares of land and they don't like trees overshading the solar panels. So unfortunately, big giants like this baobab on the right will have to make way for solar panels if this is approved. But luckily also, if you speak to the clients, usually they're quite happy to what they said. For instance, with these baobabs, all the younger ones we will mark, and then they will move them, because you can actually quite successfully move a young baobab and move them just to outside of their footprint, or make avenues of them along their access roads, as long as it doesn't overshadow the panels. And to the left is Boskia or Witgat, also quite protected. And they're quite easy to find. And we've got methodologies, because some sites are huge and you can't really mark every tree, because you have to, for every tree, has to be written up in a report, and that goes to the local authority for a permit. So you can't remove these trees without a permit. And many times they actually would also come back and say, no, you don't have to remove it, but you can prune it. So if it's not directly in your footprint, you can get a permit to prune them, but not remove them. Okay, the next slide, we get to the smaller plants. As part of the protocols, we also have a plant species protocol. There will also be one for animal species. I just focus on the plants. So if you do an overall vegetation assessment, you can miss many threatened species, because most of them are quite cryptic. They're small. If they don't flower, you can't distinguish them from another plant. For instance, if you look in the middle with that yellow flowers is an orchid that flowered in November. If I was on site in February, that would just be a dried black stalk. I wouldn't even know that orchid was there. So it's very important, and the protocols also reiterates it now, is that plant species assessments must be done in the flowering season of the species that you are expecting to be there. And I think that's something we are still lacking on. Is I think we miss a lot of these plants. And I can sometimes, I walk in one direction, I drop my GPS, I turn around, walk back, and there I find a plant that I've walked past the first time, just seeing it from a different angle. So it's really difficult to find these little ones. On the left top corner, you'll see is a little crashula. That one's not threatened, but it hides in those quartz patches. They like it there. The sun reflects off the white quartz, so it's a bit cooler for them. So a lot of species are specifically adapted to only grow there and nowhere else. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you will walk over this plant and not know it's there. On the right-hand side is also a succulent that's quite threatened. It only occurs around Carolina, nowhere else in the whole world. So if they mine up Carolina, we won't have the species anymore. You can see it's also quite small. Very difficult to find if it's not flowering. And also if you don't know exactly where it grows, very difficult to find. And the bottom left corner also, succulents, that's called Frithia pulchra. That's even smaller than the one that grows around Carolina. And they can, even in winter, they can literally, it's called pulchra, they kind of pull themselves a bit deeper into the soil. So you won't find them in winter. So really, it's very important to go out in the right season for the specific species that you think will grow. Because for instance, this orchid was flowering in November, where most orchids in Gauteng prefer to flower, they here February, March. So it's very imperative that you do your homework and know what plant species to expect and when would be the ideal time to go to site. Okay, next slide. All of this information again is available online. Oh, sorry, yeah, this is, if you look at that same site we did before, this is what the screening tool report would show you, that everything is low, most of it. So in those cultivated fields and mined areas, they're not expecting any sensitive species, but in the medium areas, the orange, there might be suitable habitat. So that's one thing that I would also have to go and check. Okay, next slide. Everything again is online. We've got the red list of South African plants. The book was published in 2009, but since then they're only updated online. There's the website. So every species in South Africa, I think we've assessed almost every species, if not, otherwise we're quite in the 90%. Every plant species growing in South Africa has been assessed according to certain criteria, which will put it in one of the risk categories. You'll see the red there on the left would be the really threatened species, and they can stop a development. And then the orange ones are the ones that you're kind of flagging that, you know, if we don't protect them now, they will go into a higher risk of extinction. Next slide. Let me see. Okay, so also on that same website, you will have this guideline from SANBI to say, okay, if for instance you have an endangered species on your site and it falls in under criteria, it's been classified endangered under criteria B, C, and D, then the guidelines is that they don't want any further loss of habitat of that species. So a plant like that could either stop a development or a layout will need to change to conserve that plant in situ, because also we moved away from trying to dig it out and conserve it somewhere else. Most of the plants die. The ideal is to conserve it in its natural habitat. So you can see a vulnerable plant would be listed under different criteria. Vulnerable under A, you know that plant that's for instance those that only grow in Carolina. So if you were to take out that area, then that plant is also gone. It doesn't grow anywhere else in the world. So, but this is just not nice for us. It helps us if you find the plant once you've had it correctly ID'd, you can see how that's going to impact on the development. The next slide is just an example of this. Example is in a species guideline that's also been made available online. So that is how it's just a guideline to help you write your report according to the protocols. But here you can see the example that they used there is in the Western Cape, and they've got fynbos on sandy fynbos, which is a threatened vegetation type. Then here in the pink area, it's transformed, but that little dotted yellow line is where the development wants to expand to. So there's already something on that site in that pink transformed area, but they would like to expand. So this assessment was done because it's a threatened vegetation type. And they, on the next slide, you'll see they've also done a threatened plant species was flagged. So they did assessment, and lo and behold, they've got critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable plant species on the same site. And they've all plotted, and then you usually put a buffer. Here they've got a 200-meter buffer around those threatened plants, which takes out everything that developer wanted to develop. You'll see that's only that which is currently transformed that can, that does not, what I mean to say, so the buffer area didn't extend into the already transformed areas, but nothing else is developable. So if you go to the next slide, that is then the final sensitivity map for vegetation and plant species. And you can see that this, because of the threatened plant species, this development cannot be allowed to expand. Okay, the next slide is also just an example, you know, the EPAF2, there's for instance just a vegetation assessment, which will probably have the river there as high, some medium grassland, and then areas that's probably been cultivated. But the avifauna person sees the site a bit different. They also have the river high, but then they've got a patch of very high and low. And then all of this needs to be combined to give you an overall sensitivity map. And I mean, this is just avifauna and vegetation. There must still be wetland maps. There's, you know, the herpetologist can say, no, but there's bullfrogs in the river, so I want a 200-meter buffer. So the maps can change with every specialist's assessment. The map keeps changing. Okay, the next slide. Sorry. Okay, just very quickly, I don't know if my time's up, but I also do alien invasive plant species assessment. That falls, I think, under NEMBA. The next slide will show you that they've classified all the alien invasive plant species in South Africa into different categories. So the next slide, please. You can also see here in front, this whole site that you could see in that picture was alien invasive plant species. So that is according to NEMBA, the 3 categories of invasive species, you know, 1A and B, you absolutely have to remove. You will not get a permit to keep those on your site. Category 2, you can, that's mostly for the plantations who need to grow wattles and eucalyptus. They can get a permit to grow these plants, but not if it's in a riparian zone. Also, I've done work, help the university or students who need to grow, for instance, castor oil, which is an invasive species, but you can get a permit to grow the castor oil because they need to get the oil to do further research on that. And then you get category 3 for people in Pretoria was very upset because jacaranda was on the list, but they have now exempted jacaranda in urban areas in Gauteng. So you can keep your jacaranda, but you're not allowed to let it spread from that position, and you're not allowed to plant new jacarandas. Now here is just a map. If I go to a site and I do an alien invasive species assessment, this is everything. This is just the category 1 species, not even the 2 and 3s. So you can see that this site has got a bit of a problem in that they will have to implement the alien invasive management plan. So that is something vegetation specialists also do. You just kind of chop up the site in different management units, and it's nice to speak to the person who manages the campus here, for instance, to decide where are we going to start. To the west, you'll see there's a bit of open space. There's also a bit of a drainage line. So that would be ideal to start there. So you prevent it spreading from your land. And then around offices, it's quite easy just to chop out big trees and then replant them with indigenous trees. Okay, next slide. So yeah, I hope that kind of gave you a bit of an overall of where I fit in. It's really, all that is just the vegetation assessment. So it's a huge process. And I always say, to me, it's still amazing that I can come home and press one switch and the lights in my house go on. And there's a lot of people who have to work together to make that work. I mean, that's still quite amazing. And I think it's the same for the environmental impact process. Sometimes it gets a bad rap, and rightly so. But I just think people must understand that it's a lot of people and a lot of opinions, and also sometimes a lot of emotion that goes into this process. So yeah, in this way, I hope to make a difference in the environment. And then on the next slide, you'll see, this is what people have once, I was called a bunny hugger by a Eskom engineer once, simply because I wanted him to move the pylon out of a wetland area. But this is not what I do. I do feel we need activists, because they are the ones who's usually the ones who's in tune with the environmental right, and they speak for all of us. But it is a scientific process. We try and keep emotion out of it and see what the science, that's why we have so many databases in South Africa. So yeah, I do in a way hope I save the planet in my own small way. Then on the last slide, you'll see, so that, we must all be aware of your environmental rights, so that this doesn't happen in your backyard or influence your water quality. Thank you. That's all. So if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. There was one question in the chat. Please provide web information for the availability of the info discussed in the past 3 slides, ecosystem, hydrology, etc.
Okay, yes, I can send. I've got actually a little page that I can just send on to you if you want to make it available, with links that you can just click on. But all of it will be on SANBI. They have a BGIS website, and then you just have to go into different projects, hydrology, but they are all national data sets and freely available.
Okay. Thank you, Antoinette. Any questions? Just put up a hand if you have a question. Yes, I see. Is it Shastri?
Yes, thanks. I see. I'm sitting in Zimbabwe right now. I work for Anglo Unki Mine. I just wanted to ask whether the same database is available throughout for other African countries like Zimbabwe.
I wouldn't know. This one specifically, South Africa. I know there has been. Somebody recently told me there could be a link also on the SANBI BGIS website to 2 other data sets maybe around us, but I wouldn't know if the Zimbabwe government or environmental affairs has spearheaded something like that. I think they do have a red list for plant species. I think most African countries are already assessing their plants. But I don't know if, I don't think South Africa has got such a data set, no.
Okay, thanks.
Next is Heather.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for an extremely informative and interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. If I'm looking at the biodiversity requirements and relating to alien plants, at one stage we were supposed to send reports in to the department, but then I noted recently, well, not recently, about 2 years ago, that section was removed. Is there any other part of the legislation that requires us to send annual reports in, or anything along those lines with regards to biodiversity?
Sure, not that I'm aware of. I think usually when there's a development, it would have an environmental management program.
Okay.
And you have to report on that. I think it's usually ECO that will do the reporting. Personally, I think that is a bit of a gray area. I think, for instance, a landowner must by law control the aliens on his property. And if he doesn't do so, or if he's unknowingly, many people don't know that they have alien species, the government, if they pick it up, can issue you a directive. And then they usually give you like 60 days to comply, and you have to then submit your alien invasive management plan, which they would sign off on. But whether they then police it, in years to come, I'm not sure. Maybe there's somebody else online that knows, but I don't know. I think, sorry, on that note, I've done a lot of management plans for mines, for instance. And I think a lot of their funding and their ISO accreditation will rely on regularly updating those plans and showing improvement in AIS management.
Thank you, Annette. Okay, Lynn, it's your turn.
Thank you. Hi, Antoinette.
Hi.
I wanted to just get some clarity with regards to some of the sensitivity categories, the ecological support areas and critical biodiversity areas. Is there consistency in the definition between the provinces and between the, I suppose, all the taxa and things that falls into it, whether it's avifauna, mammals, plants? Is there consistency across the provinces?
Yeah, if it comes to the conservation, the provincial conservation plans, they used to, when they started out, I think the Gauteng didn't call it CBAs. They had just important areas, but yeah, every province kind of had their own naming. And then eventually, as they got, because this all has to, they mandated to do this, and it feeds into the national system. So from national, they kind of decided on the specific category. So all the provinces has moved towards using the same CBA, other natural areas descriptions.
Thank you.
And every province as well, you'll see on the BJIS site, if you go into that province conservation plan, they would have the data set, but they would also have what they call the technical document or the handbook. And in that technical document, they explain how they got to that data set and what it means.
Thanks.
Adrienne, next.
Morning, Antoinette. Well done on a lovely presentation.
Thank you.
Even for us oldies and old hats, it was interesting to hear. One always learns something new, and one always gets reminded of things that we should be doing. Just a quick question, and please, if I'm putting you on the spot, tell me to shut up and go away. What is your opinion on the NEMBA changes in terms of alien invasive species and how they're trying to almost remove the importance of reporting on them and eliminating them? I don't know if you had a chance to read the new draft act.
No. Oh, sorry, when did that come out? Is it?
It came out on the 24th of May.
Okay, no, thank you. I'll see. I also learned something. I have to go and read up on it. Yeah, I'm not aware what I feel is that there's become more of a, and I say emphasis. I get a lot of requests these days for alien invasive management plan. So yeah, I'm not sure if the act cannot actually. I personally, I feel like I can see somebody's asked about pom pom. Something like that should be classified as a national emergency, according to me.
I
So we
agree.
should actually it should be more strict. I often say, and I said it again the other day, we have these Arrive Alive ads on TV. Why don't we have, alien invasive little flash bits on SABC that tells you this is pom pom, it's not as pretty as you think it is, and this is what you must do.
No, I fully
Just
agree.
like a 60-second thing on TV would really increase awareness. And I think it has to actually, reporting on it should become more stringent, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. And just one last question. If you were approached by a group of activists, would you represent them? Would you do work for them against the development?
Yes. Yeah. Look, I think once you've assessed the site and that you do feel that it was a mistake in whomever did the original studies, then yes. Yeah. As long as one can scientifically not agree with the findings of whatever the proposed development has. I've also once done work where the client is not happy with my recommendations. So that happens. He's got the right, luckily, to his credit, he did pay me, but he went on and got another specialist to write a different report. But I think that's also, the specialist, I sit alone at my house. So to me, it's nice if there's other specialists on site and I can run ideas by them. So it's still a bit of a subjective. I can look at the vegetation. I think the protocols and all our data sets makes it easier to defend something that is sensitive. But somebody else can come and say, oh, no, this is secondary. So if an official doesn't follow that up or knows about it, then I think a development can go ahead where somebody downplays the sensitivity, where an original but discarded report would have said, no, this is more sensitive. So that does happen. But I think the protocol and the screening tool results has become very important for then whomever makes that decision to weigh them up.
Yeah, I must admit it's one of the downfalls of our profession, sadly. Thank you.
Thanks.
Lisa.
Hi, Antoinette and Anya. Thanks for the presentation. I have two questions. Regarding rescue relocation plans or habitat management plans, say for instance, in Gauteng, you've got your various threatened species that aren't, they're not protected under the legislation, but you have to relocate them within, a given area. So let's say, for instance, you go to site and you have, you've identified your various threatened species, your hypoxis, your bufane. When you make the recommendations to do the rescue relocation plan, what is the client's obligation to use a SACNASP registered ecologist to oversee this rescue relocation plan, or can the client, say for instance, just kind of do the relocation on their own? Is there some sort of protocol or guideline legislation they have to abide by?
No, unfortunately not. I think that's where the local authority is very important. When they give a record of decision, that should be written in it. So as a specialist, I would recommend that these plants be removed and that they be overseen by a person accredited with SACNASP, for instance.
Yeah. So
then it's up to the department to take that recommendation and put it in the record of decision. So then it becomes law. But
yeah, so that also includes species that don't require permits for removal. Yes. For instance, the bufane and the hypoxis.
Yes.
So where is the, where do you draw the line? Where are you required to step in and make sure that things are done correctly? Because if the client does it themselves, you don't know if they're doing it in the correct manner.
Yes, definitely. What I usually do is, I had a client once asked me, he said he's got diggers on site and can he just move it? And I said, okay, just send me pictures. And we spoke through it and he told me what he wanted to do and he showed me pictures and I wrote him a plan. It was just a little 2-pager that he then submitted to the department, and it was approved. And the department, actually, Gauteng was actually on site to see that he did it well. So it does, is good news. But this was a client who really wanted to just, you know, do the right thing.
So yeah, so I've come into instances where the client just says, okay, no, they've done this before, they're going to do it. Just identify the plants and the locations, and you know, like it's very difficult to know whether it's done correctly.
Yeah, no, I think that is a big gap. I once also did it in Mpumalanga for a mine where we wrote the plan and they asked us to move it, which was great. It was really, and then I took it upon myself, and the client agreed to it, to actually send a progress report to Mpumalanga, who was very surprised and very grateful.
Oh, wow.
To have it. But there is, like you said, there's nothing to force people to do that.
Yeah, there's no like protocol. Okay, you have to have verified, etc., to oversee this entire relocation. But yeah. Okay, so there's nothing out there to.
No, not that. And I think that's why also when it comes to really threatened species, they don't want it to be moved. It has to be conserved where it is.
Okay, sorry. And the last question: do you, when you do your desktop assessments, do you ever consider iNaturalist records?
Yes, definitely. Sorry, I didn't even list. Yeah, definitely. I also, the protocols also want you to add your pictures to iNaturalist. There's a bit of a grey area. It's supposed to flag threatened species and obscure the localities. But I've had it before where I flagged a near threatened species, luckily went back to site to count some more of them because there was quite a lot, and then found that they've been, you know, many of them have been dug out from that site. So I'm so careful about what I put on iNaturalist. I definitely obscure the view, but it's not, you know, for somebody to really figure out where you've been and where this plant species is. It's not too difficult. But yeah, I think it's iNaturalist it's fantastic. I don't know what I agree. What I did before it.
I agree, but yeah, you got to be careful. You don't know.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
quickly just to the comment section, and then I will give Heather and Lynn a chance again. So quickly, one of the things was, how often do you find the influence? How often do your findings influence the choice of the said alternatives to the original proposed area? For example, diverting a path of a pipeline or a power line or a bridge?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think in the last couple of years, I've been seeing it, but 17 years ago, really, you know, if I look at when I was in environmental education, your job was gratifying immediately. But here you churn out a report, you send it in, you don't even know if that development eventually happens because you're just busy with the next report. So personally, I would have liked to get feedback, and I think there the system can still improve, that the specialists eventually do get feedback if something was approved or not. So I don't know if I'm actually answering your question, but I've had where you sit with a client with alternatives, where the client heeds the specialist recommendations and would then go for an alternative. So that does happen. I'm also busy. There's a lot of solar panels happening at this stage, and trying to fit them in. They like square, you know, blocks. And how do you put the blocks in between wetland areas and ecological corridors? So, but they are really trying to also, I mean, they must be feasible to try and conserve as much as they can in between. So I think in the last couple of years, it's definitely becoming more prominent. But there are, you know, people who just, they want to do what they want to do. And it's only if government does not, because they have had projects that has been rejected. I also, a while ago, was involved in a mining project, proposed mining, where all of the specialist reports said, no, this should not happen. The client was adamant that, you know, if he doesn't mine it, somebody else is going to mine it. But eventually the environmental consultant, the person between me, the specialists, and the client, also withdrew and just said ethically, they do not feel that they should carry on with this project. So as far as I know, they probably, somebody is still wanting to mine that area, but at least, you know, the people in the business ethically withdrew and said this shouldn't happen.
The conscience of the business.
Yes.
Then we've got a question on what's the best way to remove pom-pom weed, if you have any leads on that.
Yes, there is. Maybe I should send it. You know what? That's also. It's going to be. I'll send you. A lot of links.
Yes.
Pom weed is a terrible thing. The best thing is, if you can't spray it immediately, is to start removing the flower heads. So it's manual labor, but literally walk through and remove and bag the flower heads, because if one little flower produces thousands of seeds, and they just germinate wherever they land. So the best is to literally walk through and pick those flowers before they set seed. You can even burn them in the braaivleis if you have to. But just make sure that they can't germinate. That's a good way to at least curb, the next year's germination. Then I know there's a chemical that you spray. It's usually somewhere in February, but it's quite specific. You have to spray them at a certain time. But Working for Water has got a toolbox. They call it an environmental toolbox. I think it's on the invasive species, invasive.org website. I'll also send you the link, and in that they've got invasive species that you can, look for your species, and then they've got a recommended method of removal, including a recommended herbicide that you can use. So I think that would be the best, and that's updated regularly. So as they find that something doesn't work or shouldn't be used, they would change that website. There's quite a new data set on now.
Yeah. And I know they are doing some biological control research as well on a rust on the pom weeds, which is really, really amazing.
Yes.
Then the last comment here, except for a few thanks, Antoinette, I'll divert you to that later. Gauteng specifically has other guidelines and frameworks that outline biodiversity objectives, like the Gauteng Regis guideline.
Yes.
These do not seem to be included in the screening tool or C-plan. How much weight do the limitations of these tools have in the assessment process?
They should have. I agree completely. Gauteng has got some amazing policies, but again, they're policies and guidelines. So if somebody takes, the environmental affairs to court and said, but I want my development, it's the law. These things should become gazetted to actually give them a bit more meaning. But you'll see the protocol refers to the minimum report content. So that is the minimum that must be in there. And if you look at the guideline for the protocols, it will tell you that, you have to, this is the plant species we think from our data set could occur there, but you have to look broader than that. Again, I look at iNaturalist, I look at previous reports in that area, I look at SANBI's red list plant species to see what other plant species could also occur there. Experience plays a role. I used to, with Gauteng, their RIDGE policy is amazing, and I used to use that in other provinces as best practice, because I think NEMA also says you use best practice, and so yeah, those policies are important. They do carry weight. In Gauteng, a lot of developments, Gauteng just said, no, you're on a ridge, we're not supporting that development. So that has happened. Those policies are very important, and I would like to see them in every province. But they are policies. But yes, you have to address them. They would be addressed in a good vegetation report would address the ridge, or any provincial guideline for that matter. Yeah.
Lynn, you've got the last say, it seems.
Thank you. You touched on something earlier, which I just wanted to almost raise for the audience, is that post-authorization aspect. A lot of our legislation seems to focus on new developments, but there's very little support for the determining whether the impact identification was correct and whether all the various management plans have actually been implemented, which I find quite sad because it then doesn't look at the full picture. And if we consider the relocation of species, just your thoughts on this. Is there any follow-up work done to see whether the relocation was successful? And does anybody ever ask the question, when you're moving species to an area, why that area didn't originally have those species, and perhaps the area is unsuitable and the relocation would then be unsuccessful after, say, 10 to 15 years?
Yes, yeah, no, I agree with you. Sorry, I don't even know where to start answering that. Like I said, it's up to the landowner, I think, to regularly check in with the department to say these things. Like I had that example, I actually just moved crinums for a mine in Mpumalanga, and they had me come back a year later to see if everything was well, and I wrote a report, and so, but that was the mine. that decided to do so. But I haven't seen, I think the authorities can put it in the record of decision. If you can, if in your environmental authorization, I think the authorities should, at least put in there that we want a monitoring report 2 years from now or 1 year from now. After you've moved it, we want images. I've done work for a mine as well in Limpopo, where literally the environmental manager would phone me and say, listen, they just, I know there's succulents here and they want to just make a road here, please come. And 2 days later, we're on site removing succulents in front of because he knows they're protected. And again, it's up to the person or the environmental manager. But I do think there's place in the record of decision to say, we want to report 2 years from now on this. Then when it comes to, a lot of times plants are moved. Interestingly, when I had a conversation with Mpumalanga where to move plants to, they actually said, we don't want you to move them into good condition grassland, because as you're trampling there, you're digging holes, you actually having an impact on that grassland by saving. So rather look for areas on the outskirts of the development where there's some edge effects or areas that being rehabilitated, and put the plants in there to contribute. And then you just have to really, if you've got a good plan to monitor it, and I always refer to ISO that, if you see something goes wrong, you have to take corrective action. So then the mine must phone the specialist or horticulturist and say, listen, our plants are dying, what can we do?
Yeah, because that also raises the question is, what are the consequences if the relocation is unsuccessful? And that's where the post-authorization part becomes quite concerning, is that it's all very well to say, yes, you can go ahead, provided you move things. But if the relocation is not successful, and then the developer already has his development, they don't, the species is lost.
And some species like orchids, you can't move. They're not going to, grassland orchids are very tricky to grow. So, you can try. Bulbs are easy, and that's why people mostly move the bouffants, the crinums, even some gladiolus. But the smaller and some succulents you can move. But real grassland species are very, very difficult to grow outside of their habitat. So I think that's also why when it comes to threatened species, it's just a no-go. They have to be conserved in situ.
Thank you.
It seems like we've come to the end of our questions. Antoinette, thank you very much for presenting. I hear it's your first online thing here.
I was very nervous.
We
to my computer.
We really, really appreciate the information. Even I got a few new websites to go and check out. So thank you very much, and thank you for the passion for these special biodiversity that we have. Just a last comment from me. I've got a colleague who works in Mexico, and she says we are so blessed with biodiversity in South Africa, and I think we should see it more as a national treasure. So thank you very much, and thank you for everybody who supports LASA. Please check our Facebook page and everything to see if there would be more web chats in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.